These next two chapters are also a little bit long. Just to remind you, Madame Ratignolle and Mrs. Pontellier and Robert have come back from the beach, and Robert continues to walk Madame Ratignolle home because she is complaining of being stiff. And as soon as they get away from Mrs. Pontellier, he kind of gets a talking to from Madame Ratignolle. She says, "Do me a favor, Robert. Let Mrs. Pontellier alone." So I thought this was interesting. My first thought is she jealous that Robert is paying so much attention to another woman? And in fact, that's even what Robert says. He's like, "Oh, are you jealous?" And she says, "No, not at all. I'm serious. Leave her alone." And he becomes serious himself, and he's like, "Why?" And she says, "Well, she is not like us. She might make the unfortunate blunder of taking you seriously." So this is another cultural reference. This is an indication that the Creole are very expressive, somewhat flirtatious and open, and that people, might misread their sort of affectionate manner. And because Mrs. Pontellier is not Creole, but, everybody else, the Ratignolles, the Lebruns are, she's saying perhaps she'll misunderstand. And Robert is very annoyed by this. And he says, "Well, why shouldn't she take me seriously? Am I a comedian, a clown, a jack-in-the-box? Why shouldn't she, you Creoles?" Which I thought was interesting because my understanding is he is also Creole. His mother is Madame Lebrun. But, he's of a different generation. And I do think that as we have more and more generations, people tend to feel less connected to their heritage. And so he may not feel as Creole as his mother or the other older people on the island might feel. So he may not feel like, he might feel more modern compared to them. And they get into quite an argument. She's like, "If your attentions to any married women here were ever offered with any intention of being convincing, you would not be the gentleman we all know you to be." So she's saying to him, certainly you're not seriously flirting with Madame or with Mrs. Pontellier, because if you were, you wouldn't be a gentleman. Like, that would be rude. You shouldn't be chasing married women. And so that's what she's sort of telling him here. And he's still very upset. And he goes on then to compare himself to other men who were much worse. Other men, like, we don't know who these people are, but like Alcea Robin, who, went after the consul's wife in Biloxi, and just other people who boldly went after someone's spouse. He's saying, I'm not like any of those people. And but then he flips the table on her and he says, "Actually, you make a mistake. There is no earthly possibility of Mrs. Pontellier ever taking me seriously." He said, "You should have warned me against taking myself seriously." So he seriously, I'm interpreting this to mean, he seriously does have a crush on Mrs. Pontellier, but Mrs. Pontellier is not reciprocating, according to him. And so he kind of shuts her down by saying that. And then he just pivots and he says, "What would you like, now that he's gotten her home?" Because remember, she's always complaining of some ailment. "Would you like some bouillon?" Bouillon, if you don't know, is like broth, just like a chicken broth or a beef broth. "Or should I stir you a toddy," which would be like, a hot tea with some bourbon or something in it. "Let me mix you a toddy with a drop of Angostura," which is like little bitters. And she agrees to have him get her some bouillon. So he goes off to the kitchen and fixes her the bouillon and brings it back in a very nice, fine china cup with a little cracker. So he's completely kowtowing to her. And then he thanks her and leaves. We have a reference here to the lovers. We don't know who the lovers are, but there are lovers on the island, which I guess makes sense. They were just entering the grounds of the pension. They were leaning towards each other as the water oaks bent from the sea. There was not a particle of earth beneath their feet. Their heads might have been turned upside down, so absolutely did they tread upon the blue ether. And then the lady in black, the religious one who's always saying prayers and, going through her rosary beads, looks paler than, more jaded than usual. Mrs. Pontellier is nowhere around. So it's interesting, the presence of the lovers. I do think this just reminds us that this is summer. This is a romantic place. People are falling in love. Robert is 26 years old. It would make sense that he would want a little drama of a different sort in his life. Maybe a love affair, maybe a closer friendship. So it's getting close to dinner. He goes back to his home. His mother, Madame Lebrun, is sewing. We get some important background on their family. He takes a book out of his pocket and he starts to energetically read it. So clearly, Robert is very upset by this conversation he had with Madame Ratignolle. And so while his mother is sewing, making all kinds of noise, just the energy of this scene is just very tense. Lots of noise. He's frantically reading. And she asks him, where's Mrs. Pontellier? And Robert says, oh, she's down at the beach with the children. And his mother remembers that she wanted to lend her a book. And then Robert says, where is Victor going in the Rockaway? So here's an obvious question. Who is Victor? This is not a character we have met. Just keep in mind, when this happens in a book, it can make you feel really stupid. Like, oh my God, I missed a character someplace. Who is Victor? We have not been introduced to Victor, so just be patient. It's a good place to put a question mark because we don't know who he is. Also, by the way, do we know what a rockaway is? This is not anything that we talk about in our day-to-day. A rockaway is a horse-drawn carriage. So they're on an island that has no cars. And so they are getting around by horse and carriage. And there is still a place in the United States today that is still like that. It's called Mackinac Island. It is up near the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And you take a ferry to get there. And when you get there, there are horses and carriages that you can just flag down like a taxi, and they'll take you around to different places on the island. So that's what this is referring to. So the mother's all flustered. Well, call him back. And Robert utters a shrill, piercing whistle. So you can really feel the tension here. He's just the noise of the sewing machine, the noise of his whistle, the frantic yelling for Victor. And she flew to the window, Victor, Victor, Victor. Madame Lebrun went back to the machine, crimson with annoyance. Victor was the younger son and brother. Okay, so now we know who Victor is. Victor is Robert's younger brother. And he has a temper which invited violence and a will which no axe could break. So he's a rebel. He's difficult. He's running out and doing whatever he wants. We don't know how old he is. So then the mother starts to lament that if your father had only lived, and all this clatter, clatter, clatter is the sound of her sewing machine. So we're getting some background here that Monsieur Lebrun died 20 years ago. So that would have been when Robert was 6 years old. And then Robert asks his mother, what do you hear of Montel? And then this is also a new character. I don't know who Montel is. Montel was a middle-aged gentleman whose vain ambition and desire for the past 20 years had been to fill the void which Monsieur Lebrun, taking off, had left in the Lebrun household. So he's kind of a do-gooder. Like, he wants to step in and help the family. We don't really know if he wants to marry Madame Lebrun. Perhaps he does. After all, she has this wonderful property. But he's kind of acting as a stand-in father, is how I would describe it. And it sounds like they do have a relationship with him. And then Madame Lebrun says, well, I have a letter somewhere. Oh, here it is. He says to tell you he will be in Veracruz at the beginning of next month. And then Robert gets annoyed about that. Well, why didn't you tell me before? You know I wanted to. Like, obviously, he likes having a relationship with this man because he doesn't have a father anymore. So the way this chapter ends, I think, is just an obvious reaction to the stressful conversation that he had with Madame Ratignolle. He is annoyed for being caught, found out, so to speak, kind of having a crush on Mrs. Pontellier, and so he's all, in a fuss about it. So in this next chapter, it's going to transition to the evening time, the dinner time, at the main house of the resort. And there are lights on everywhere. There are huge decorations, branches of orange and lemons decorating this beautiful dining room. And it's Saturday night. It's also, actually, I should make sure I make a correction here. It's not later the same evening. It's a few weeks later. So after this conversation now, we've jumped a couple weeks ahead, and it's the weekend. All the husbands have come back to the island after working during the week, and there's going to be sort of an impromptu party. Just a big dinner. The kids are playing. Kids are performing, singing songs, reading little readings, and this is kind of all that's described here as different people perform. The parrot on the front porch is yelling, making all kinds of noise, which is annoying. So this is really just like it's not a terribly important chapter, but I would definitely want you to just notice here that some of the descriptions of what people are doing in terms of just having fun. And the kids go off to bed eventually, and they have cake. That's basically what happens. There's a dance and different kinds of skits. At one point then, once the kids are off to bed, which is right over here, and they have ice cream and cake, then the mood shifts. And I think this is a good place to really pay closer attention. I think there are some quotes here that would be really helpful if you were writing a paper. So they complain. I thought this was sort of funny. They pass out this cake and they all say it was excellent if it had less vanilla or if it had more sugar. So they're all sort of criticizing the cake that apparently Victor has made. So Victor is fancying himself a baker. Mrs. Pontellier danced with her husband twice, and once with Robert and once with Monsieur Ratignolle, because Madame Ratignolle is playing the piano for everybody. And then she goes out onto the veranda by herself. And this is just becoming a theme. She often goes away from people and just has time alone. So the moon is coming up. It's a mystic shimmer casting million lights across a distant, restless water, which I think shows the mood again. Clearly a lot of restlessness going on in these two chapters. And then Robert comes out and he says, "Would you like to hear Mademoiselle Ray's play?" And of course, Edna would like to hear her play, but she feared it would be useless to entreat her. And Robert says, "Well, I'll ask her." And then they describe Mademoiselle Ray's, who is an older woman. She's dragging a chair in and out of her room, and at intervals objecting to the crying of a baby, which a nurse in the adjoining cottage was endeavoring to put to sleep. She was a disagreeable little woman, no longer young, who had quarreled with almost everyone, owing to a temper which was self-assertive and a disposition to trample upon the rights of others. So she's sort of cranky, and not very many people like her. But she apparently likes Edna Pontellier. So she does agree to come and play. And so she enters the hall in between the dance, and she makes a little bow as she goes in. And then she says to Robert, "Ask Mrs. Pontellier what she would like to hear me play." Well, Edna is embarrassed of drawing attention to a certain song that she would want. She's embarrassed of being sort of signaled out by her. She would not dare to choose, and so she begs Mademoiselle Reyes to please herself in her selections. Just play what you would like. Edna is very fond of music. Musical strains have a way of evoking pictures in her mind. She sometimes likes to sit in the room of mornings when Madame Ratignolle played or practiced. One piece that lady played Edna had entitled Solitude. So Mademoiselle Reyes has played a song that Edna doesn't know the title of, but she gave it her own title called Solitude, because when she heard it, there came before her Imagination, the figure of a man standing beside a desolate dock on the seashore. He was naked. His attitude was one of hopeless resignation as he looked toward a distant bird winging its flight away from him. So much symbolism here. A person exposed, vulnerable, alone, not free to fly like the bird. Interesting that it's a man, because clearly I think also Edna feels this way. So this is just like an image that she thinks of when she hears this song, whatever it's actually called. Another piece called to her mind a dainty young woman clad in an empire gown, taking mincing, dancing steps as she came down a long avenue between tall hedges. Again, women penned in, unable to take large steps, small steps, with hedges on either side. So very much like a straight and narrow path and no deviation from that, which is also clearly sort of what the Victorian age was like for women. For the very first chords that she hears, a keen tremor goes down Mrs. Pontellier's spine. She's very moved by this music, and for the first time, she's tempered to take an impress of abiding truth. It's like she really does feel when she hears this music that there's some deeper truth to that music. She waits for the material pictures, which she thought would gather and blaze before her imagination, like she always would think about, like the man standing on the dock or the woman walking through the tall hedges. But this time, she doesn't have any pictures when she hears this song. There are no pictures of solitude or hope or longing or despair, but the very passions themselves were aroused within her soul. So instead of seeing, hope or longing, she's feeling solitude, hope, longing, and despair, lashing it as the waves daily beat upon her splendid body. So she has this beautiful body. This is a strength. And yet the waves are beating upon her, which is a negative thing. She trembled. She was choking, and the tears blinded her. So she's incredibly overcome with emotion. When Mademoiselle has finished, she arose, and bowing her stiff, lofty bow, she went away, stopping for neither thanks nor applause. As she passed along the gallery, she patted Edna on the shoulder. "How did you like my music?" she asked. And then Edna is unable to answer because she's so emotional. She pressed the hand of the pianist convulsively. Mademoiselle Reyes could tell that she'd been crying. And then she pats her again upon the shoulder and she says, "You are the only one worth playing for." So clearly Edna, again, is being singled out as different. Those others, bah, is what she says to her. But she was mistaken about those others. Her playing had aroused a fever of enthusiasm. Everybody was moved by her. What passion, what an artist. I have always said no one could play Chopin like Mademoiselle Reyes. That last prelude, it shakes a man. So even a man was emotional about how she played. It was growing late and there was a general disposition to disband, but someone, perhaps it was Robert, thought of a bath at that mystic hour and under the mystic moon. So here it is late at night, and Robert suggests to the whole crowd that they should go down to the ocean and go swimming.